This training video is being brought to you by SQL Server 2014 tutorial.com. Today, basically, we are going to look at how to manage security in SQL Server. So let's get going. So really, what is the agenda today? Well, first we are going to cover different layers of security in SQL Server. Then we will cover some security jargon that is vital in understanding the concepts. We will move on to authentication and principles. Then we are going to look at concept of roles in MS SQL 14, and then some other vital T-SQL that's related to the security context. And finally, we will finish with the security enhancement in SQL Server 2014. So quite a few things going on. Let's get right to it. So as far as layers of security, well, there are many layers of security, but as you know, security nowadays, especially with all the hackers and websites being brought down by fun people, it is a huge topic in any database platform. As such, security in SQL is vital, and like I mentioned, there are many layers of security. So let's go down the list. Well, the first one is physical security. So really, you want to limit the access to the server. Have a dedicated storage for it, or if you are I guess sharing space with maybe a data center or whatnot, and then you need to have a all the network security in place. The next one is the OS, the operating system security. So you want to use something that's secure. Obviously, SQL runs on Windows, so you want to make sure you have the latest and greatest operating system with all the service packs and hot fixes in place. Now, regarding SQL services, these are things like the database engine. If you're running, let's say, reporting services or analysis services, all those should be running under a dedicated domain account. In the past, people would use the domain account, same account that is used for Windows administration. That is a big no-no. You want to isolate this account. Think of it, if somebody gets a hold of this account, they can really wreak havoc and bring down your database platform. Now, also the file and folder security is important, especially when it comes down to the files. This would include the MDF file, the LDF file, and also obviously the backup folders. So in SQL, you want to use the principle of least privilege. That basically means that you want to give the minimum amount of access to a user that can get their job done. So for example, let's say if you have a report writer that is maybe using, I don't know, SQL reporting services or Crystal or something along those lines, they have no need to change the data. Well, it does not make any sense to give them write permissions. You can just give them the read permissions, and that should take care of that. And finally, the last one, which you will not see in a lot of places nowadays, especially everybody's trying to do more with less, but you should really have a written security policy in place. This should govern things like who gets what access, especially if you have SA access. That should be limited to simply the database group. In small to medium-sized companies, it's not uncommon to find, many different people and groups having that level of access. Okay, so in SQL, I kind of broke this down. It really, it starts, I guess, at the OS level, goes to server, then to database, and then to objects. And we will definitely look into this. But let's look at some of these important terms that you need to understand. So first one is the principal. This is not the principal at your high school. It's actually an entity that can request a SQL Server resource. So example of principals in SQL 2014 would be logins and users, and we are going to look at these in detail. Now there's also the concept of role, which is basically similar to the concept of group in Windows. We have a object called a schema. This is really nothing more than a container of database objects like tables and views. The objects are really owned by the schema and not the user. So how would that make sense? Well, let's say if you have a database for your organization, and there are separate tables that have to do with HR, versus other tables that have to do with engineering. You would want to keep those objects under different schemas, because engineers don't need to look at HR and vice versa. The next thing is very important. This is the concept of a securable. This is really any resource that can be accessed. So in the first step, when we were talking about a principal, when you create a database user and they may need access to, let's say, a table to select or change data, when we're talking about the underlying object like a table, view, stored procedure, whatnot, those are going to be a securable. And then we have some advanced concepts like certificates and keys. This is really basically a way for you to encrypt the data in SQL Server. Now there's another important concept of authentication, and we'll talk more about principles, but basically regarding authentication you have two choices. You have Windows versus SQL Server. Okay, the Windows really can be a local login on a machine or a domain login, but whereas the SQL Server login, this is always going to be managed by SQL. Now the principal, like I mentioned, is an object that can request a SQL Server resource or a securable. The best practice really is to use Windows authentication. You want to use a Windows level principal. This could obviously be, like I mentioned, a domain login. You could even create a Windows group. And the reason for that is simple. Okay, the Windows, it processes these when the account logs in, there is encryption that is handled by the Windows operating system, versus where when you're using SQL you are bypassing that. But why use a SQL login anyway? Well, there are going to be situations where you may have an account that's on a non-Windows OS like Unix or Linux or Apple or whatnot. So those are the scenarios that you are going to use in non-Windows authentication. So as far as demo, we want to switch gears and I want to show you some of the stuff in action. I'm going to first create a SQL Server login using the create login command. Then I will create a database user using the create user command. And for our demo today, we are using a SQL 2014 Enterprise Edition, and the database is Northwind, which has been around for, I want to say, decades at this point. But anyway, so I'm going to create SQL. I'm trying to launch SQL 2014 here. This is a instance that I'm running locally, and I'm actually going to log in as SA for now, because we will be creating some logins and whatnot. So I'm logged into the SQL Server. Again, let me just show you the database. We have Northwind database. This is a really easy to work with database. You have customers, orders, and whatnot, those type of objects in here. Now the first thing we are going to do is let me just expand and make sure I don't have an HR user. I'm going to create one shortly. So let me minimize this. I do have a script here that I put together. So we will just simply go down the list and and look at these one by one. So our step one is to really create a SQL Server login. So again, like I mentioned, you can create a Windows login or you can use a SQL login. Okay, for now we are going to use a SQL login. So the first command for this is going to be create login, and the password I'm using is extremely simple, but for now that is fine, because I will be testing things and I want to create something that is simple. So let's go ahead and create this first. And by the way, you can also do this in the Management Studio. In fact, all you would need to do is you would just come here, right click, and select a new login. I'm just trying to do everything at the using T-SQL, and maybe some of the other things I can show you with SSMS. But now notice that I do not have an HR owner user, but when I right click here, we should have this HR owner user. Now one thing to note that all I did right now is I just created login. If I go to Northwind and I expand Security tab and expand the Users tab, you will notice that I do not have an HR owner. I do have an HR owner one, and in fact, let me go ahead and delete that one. I think that was another demo that I was working on. So now notice that in Northwind at the user level I do not have HR owner. Okay, so now that is going to be my next step. So for this one I'm going to basically, create user. So the first command, remember, was a login. This one is going to be a user. Now it's slightly different. What I'm saying is I would like to create a user for what? Well, for this login. So this is a little confusing in SQL. People that are new to SQL, they don't understand it. These are two separate objects. This one that's highlighted is actually a login, which again is at the SQL Server level, whereas this is a database user, which is at the database level. So you have to have this one in place first, and then you can run the next one. So now another thing you want to notice that this one I'm running at the database level. Currently I'm connected to master. You can tell this by also looking down here that I'm master, and here's the account that I'm using. I'm using SA. So let's go ahead and execute this. Okay, so that's good. That creates the user. Now if I come here and right click and refresh, you will notice that we have an HR owner in the Northwind database. Okay, that's great. Let's go ahead and try to connect, and I'm going to just copy.